The flight of refugees is not a new problem. It has been with us for a long, long time. And we can go back several centuries to see people fleeing from primitive wars, from economic crises. In fact, without exaggeration, it could be argued that the entire history of the world is a history of migration, seeking refuge, exiles in virtually every corner of the world. After the Second World War, there was a huge wave of refugees fleeing the victors, having once fled those who had now been defeated. It's worth remembering that of all the Jews who tried to leave Germany and seek refuge in the United States and Britain, not many were admitted. Many were turned back. Some went back to Germany. Others sought refuge in what was then an imaginary space in their minds in Palestine, but many died in the camps because they were not given refuge. A story often forgotten. And if you look at the newspapers, France, Britain, in the United States, there was a big demand by the right to stop Jewish refugees pouring in. We are threatened by a flood of Jewish refugees, wrote many newspapers. After the defeat of Hitler, it was refugees going the other way, newly captured territories by the Russian Red Army in Czechoslovakia, in Poland, new conquests. Citizens of German origin then had to flee back to Germany and remained a potent force in German politics, strongly backing the right-wing parties. So this movement of peoples is always very frightening, and it's dealt with in different ways. Not many cared about the Jewish refugees during the Hitler period. Even fewer worried about citizens of German origin or ethnic Germans who were being expelled from large parts of Europe as new cities were being created. And then soon after the Second World War, we had two large movements of refugees. When India was divided and two countries were carved out, India and Pakistan, there was a bloodbath. Millions of refugees fled from one country to the other. Since the new country, Pakistan, was going to be based largely on Muslims, it was a Muslim state, the effect was to drive out, consciously or unconsciously, all the Hindus and Sikhs who lived in what was then Pakistan, and many Muslims were hounded out of what was to become India. The figures are still not known, but the estimates are that at least 1 million people died in this movement of peoples. And because they came from poor families, they were peasants, mainly, fleeing from one village to another. Their graves are unmarked. Some bodies were burned, mass graves were created. Not a single monument in the Indian subcontinent marks the death of those who died to see India partitioned. Following that, which happened in 1947, we had the birth of Israel and the expulsion by the new Israeli government, the hardcore Zionists who created Israel, could only create it by expelling 700,000 Palestinians from their land. Evidence newly released over the last decade shows that Palestinian women were raped by Jewish soldiers, children suffered, and the Jews had no compunction whatsoever in driving the Palestinians out because, as many of their leaders said, it's the only way to create an Israeli state. Lots of atrocities were committed. And in fact, the creation of UNRWA, the United Nations body responsible for refugees, was decided on after the Palestinian expulsion. The latest official figures of Palestinian refugees are at about 6 million. Many of these have, of course, found more new homes or traveled abroad, but still, their number in their millions, and many still live in camps. On a recent trip to Australia, a continent with huge tracts of land where nobody lives, or very few people live, and which could easily accommodate more refugees, the Australian government, still a white Australian government by and large in terms of the way it thinks, has kept refugees in camps on neighboring islands which are, technically speaking, not part of Australia, but effectively are Australian extensions. Here, refugees are let in, kept in camps. Privatized security groups supposedly take charge of them. Many of these people in these camps are former policemen or former military people, and the reports coming out of these islands is deeply shocking. Much worse, by the way, than anything in Europe, because what whistleblowers have reported is that the refugees are treated like terrorists, that many of them are tortured, that waterboarding is common, that there have been several cases of refugee women, young women being raped by those men to look after them, and slowly a big crisis is building up on this issue. And interestingly enough, neither the ruling Conservative Party, the Liberal Party, nor the opposition party, the Labour Party, are taking this issue up in the way in which they should. They're trying to ignore it. It's the whistleblowers who are being attacked, and some decent newspapers are reporting these events. There's recently been a hue and cry on television, but effectively, nothing much is being done. So it's important to contextualize why refuge is sought, why people flee. And the two reasons have by and large been the same. There's economic migration from famines. One can go back to the huge migration of Irish people to the United States after the potato famine. One can still look at the migrations going on from Ireland, from Portugal, from Spain partially, from Italy, to escape the crisis-ridden countries and seek refuge either in Europe or, in the case of the Portuguese, elsewhere in the world, Angola, Brazil. The Irish come to Britain, they go to the United States, they go to Australia, they go to Canada. And in each and every case, some of the finest young people are fleeing to seek refuge. And it's important to contextualize this fact. Prior to the current upheavals that we have been watching, the early years of this century and the last years of the last century saw huge crises in Africa. We saw the massacres in Rwanda, where the victimized Tutsis came and united with a neighboring regime and expelled 1 million Hutus from that country. They sought refuge. Prior to that, we had seen the civil wars in Yugoslavia, where lots of Kosovars, lots of Bosnians, lots of Serbs, some Croatians became refugees. The largest number of refugees created by that war were Serbian, something it is not fashionable to acknowledge. And most of them were fortunately given refuge in Serbia. which was the dominant state of the former Yugoslavia. But that is when the question of refugees began to be discussed again. And as with Rwanda, serving the needs of the refugees became tied up with the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and the so-called humanitarian wars. So the refugees were largely instrumentalized, dealt with in terms of what helped those countries which were occupying or making war. The latest round is no different. We have had now 3 large wars in the Middle East. The worst, Iraq, occupation, killings, deaths, ethnic cleansing led to millions of refugees, especially minorities. And that is still going on, by the way. This was followed by Libya, and the latest, of course, is Syria, and no doubt there are refugees coming out of the Yemen, where the Saudi Arabians, backed by Washington, are waging their own particular war. So it's no huge mystery as to why these wars are taking place and what is causing the flight of refugees. In this situation, the solutions are fairly obvious. But let's just discuss this latest wave of refugees. The principal reason for the latest and the largest since the Second World War movement of peoples across Europe is war. And these are people coming from Syria. Just over half of the 380,000 refugees who've reached Europe are Syrians fleeing the ugly civil war and the disintegration of their country. The rest, too, are mainly from war zones. Afghanistan supplies 13% of the refugees, Eritrea 8%, Iraqis, Somalis, Pakistanis from the northern border zone with Afghanistan, and the Sudanese 3% each. But it was the American war in Iraq and the occupation of the country that triggered this latest phase of destabilization in the region and its disintegration. Few can disagree with the cause of the crisis: a set of destructive imperial wars, backed in most cases by chunks of the European Union, with Britain and France competing for honors and receiving affectionate pats on the back from Washington. It was the British and French-inspired war on Libya that created the crisis that led to large numbers of Africans who had been employed by the Gaddafi government being expelled from the country, coming back to Mali, occupying Timbuktu, and going on a rampage. Having created the crisis by invading Libya, the French now invaded Mali to deal with the consequences of the crisis. And so it goes, a never-ending process. It was the image of a dead child on a Turkish beach several weeks ago that captured the European imagination and made possible a more general and critical response. Why is it that things that have been happening since the beginning of this century have no effect on public opinion, and suddenly one image, a very moving image, is plastered in the press and on television screens? Why this image? Why not other similar images in the past? After all, this unfortunate child was not the first to die in these circumstances and won't be the last. But it happens like this in the world in which we live, that one image is taken up and hurts people. There's a lot of empathy and something needs to be done. In my opinion, I think it went out of control, that the image was seen, shown, and great anger in many parts of the world that this was going on and something had to be done. Normally, these images are not boosted or seen, or if they are, they don't have an effect. So it's the combination of the coverage this was given and possibly, perhaps, a feeling that this movement of peoples from Syria to Europe was something that the West had responsibility for. I don't know. It's not easy to say, but it's a combination of a few things that was triggered by the image of the child, which got people worked up. And suddenly there was a hue and cry of, we have to take some refugees in. And then the Europeans and the Americans boasted how generous we are, how good we are. Look, we're taking in so many thousands. The Americans didn't take in many. Not that it's easy to do so, because many refugees would find it difficult to cross the Atlantic, 3,000 miles of water, not easy to cross, and planes don't take you to the US from Syria or anywhere else. So Europe, the close allies of the United States, were the countries where refugees fled. And here a quota system was worked out. The Germans tried to get all the European countries to accept a certain amount. Some resisted. Britain shamefully took very few. The Germans for a while opened their frontiers and took in tens of thousands of refugees, and then stopped because the flow showed no signs of abating. And then we saw the unpleasant faces in Europe. We saw refugees held in camps in Hungary. We saw the Hungarian guards throwing food at them like as if they were playing ball, and treating them like animals. It's like you throw food in zoos. And these images were seen as well, and still the refugees kept on coming, because a country, after all, is being destroyed. Syria will never be the same again. It'll be divided, and people were fleeing. And in many cases, these were middle-class people, doctors, lawyers, teachers, people absolutely necessary for strengthening the social infrastructure of a country and keeping it going. So will any of these Syrian refugees go back? There are still many, many Bosnian friends who came here during the civil war who have not gone back. Why? Simple reasons. That torture, punishment, inability to live because of the war situation then transforms itself into economic needs. And effectively, people who've got jobs, have managed to work, feel, why should we go back? We'll probably never get anything as good as this where we came from, because the situation is still a mess. So it's a very long-term process, and it's not going to go away. And the West shows no signs of stopping its wars and rebuilding these countries. And when it rebuilds them, it often brings in its own firms, their own workers, to help make money for corporations abroad. Something that Naomi Klein has analyzed very well in her many writings, disaster capitalism. So where are we now? 15 years ago, before this crisis, we experienced a similar narrative. At that time, it was the unique, epic photography of the Brazilian maestro Sebastião Salgado that stirred the conscience of the many continents. This was followed by a remarkable, if tragically underrated, essay by Jeremy Harding, published in the London Review of Books. It was essentially a searing set of eyewitness accounts of what was taking place. Later published as a book, The Uninvited, Harding described the desperation of the refugees, the economic migrants in this case, trying to breach the walls of Fortress Europe from the Adriatic and the Mediterranean. Albanians struggling on motorized rubber dinghies, North and West Africans held captive in the primitive camp prisons of Ceuta. The most haunting and horrifying and moving images in the book were that of kids from Guinea clinging to the undercarriage of a jumbo jet and rapidly freezing to death. A pregnant West African woman committing suicide in a Spanish prison cell. Later, there came the sad stories of Chinese migrants arriving dead, suffocated in container trucks and discarded like so much rubbish on an English beach. That was the concrete result of the dehumanized directives imposed by European Union bureaucrats who turned their backs when confronted with the dead bodies. This time, the beginnings of the crises, the camps in Calais, the boat deaths in Lampedusa, the callousness of European cabinet ministers, some of whom actually said that it doesn't matter if they die, it acts as a deterrent. All this has been transcended by the waves of refugees from the Middle East who crossed the Balkans and was simply too large to ignore. The politicians could not surf on them. Within a week, all the former EU directives had been blown apart, and the German government decreed that borders be opened and pushed the European Union to accept quotas. Well, we know what happened after that. Germany was, of course, willing to take in 800,000 refugees, while David Cameron in Britain suggested 20,000 by 2020 would be enough. Why is the gap so huge? Where do the British people stand? Is EU generosity part of the reason why many British people want to leave the EU? Germany's generosity appears touching. 6 billion euros extra budget, welcoming signs after the Hungarian ordeal. Apartment sharing with refugees. Is Germany the only European nation that stands on moral ground? Till December 1992, Article 16 of the German Constitution uniquely contained a refugee clause that guaranteed absolute right of entry to all asylum seekers fleeing from political persecution. Obviously, this was a serious attempt to right the wrongs of both the Third Reich and the British and US governments that seriously restricted the quota of Jewish refugees during the 30s and 40s of the last century. The most effective demagogic English tabloid, the Daily Mail, then carried headlines warning against the flood of Jews seeking refuge. And today, the same newspaper wages similar campaigns against the new refugees from Syria. The makers of the new German constitution did not want this to happen ever again. The ethnic civil war in Yugoslavia and the subsequent breakup of that country, for which incidentally the German SPD Green government was partially responsible, created 500,000 refugees, of which 100,000 were given asylum in Germany. Till 1992, the clause in the Constitution resulted in 70% of those who sought asylum in the European Union being taken in by Germany. In 1993, there was a shift. The required two-thirds majority in the German parliament, the Bundestag, was obtained to amend Article 16. The Bundestag now took back the absolute right of entry. It imposed new restrictions that included only accepting asylum seekers who arrived in Germany directly and not via a safe third country. This included the entire European Union, among others. Despite all this, Germany remains a first port of call for many, and the amendment has been clearly violated by Angela Merkel permitting the entry of Syrian refugees via many safe countries that include NATO stalwart Turkey, Greece, Hungary, Austria, etc. Almost 50,000 plus refugees boarded trains, buses, or walked on motorways towards the safest haven, chanting "Germany, Germany." As they crossed the borders, hundreds of German citizens welcomed them. It's a pleasing picture, but deceptive. There is a lot of ugliness too. And recalling this, the German government soon suspended the Schengen Agreement and stopped any more trains coming in. Xenophobia has been on the increase in Germany for the last few decades, and there is a sizable section of the population that is deeply hostile to immigration of any sort. One should not be totally surprised when compassion evaporates and a deadly backlash begins. There have been many murderous attacks on citizens of Vietnamese and Turkish origin, some of them revealing complicity between neo-fascists and segments of the state apparatus. Some of the latter have covered up the activities of far-right groups and foiled investigations because they sympathize with them. The EU calling for mandatory refugee quotas is at best a temporary solution. What is really needed is an end to wars and an end to the destruction of social infrastructures that leave the majority without any social safety net. For while the latest crisis is a result of violent wars, there is a continuing outflow caused by neoliberal free market policies imposed on the globe after 1991. And this is not simply a south to north movement. Emigration from Portugal to Brazil, Angola and Britain is the largest in Europe. Many young Irish people are emigrating once again, and not a few Greeks are in search of new destinations. Is the United States accountable for what happened in Syria? To a certain extent, yes. After all, it's directly responsible for the destruction of Iraq, and it was that led to the Sunni-Shia civil wars in Iraq, Syria, and the Yemen. The birth of ISIS is one consequence. It was the 6-month bombing of Libya that killed between 20 to 30,000 people, that destroyed the country where 3 jihadi groups, including ISIS and Al-Qaeda, share control of the state. This was the price of regime change. And the domino effect reached Mali, as black Africans in Libya were forced to flee the country after the fall of Gaddafi. Many returned to Mali, captured Timbuktu, and were heading towards the capital. The regime was saved by a French military intervention. Just think of how and why events unfurl. The notion that all would have been well in Syria had the West intervened and toppled Assad is risible. The situation would have been the same or even worse as the jihadist alliance cleansed the country of minority groups within or outside Islam. The one thing that is very clear is that Western interventions are the problem, not the solution. The bombing raids on ISIS have till now had very little impact. Politicians in the European Union, the United States, Australia, Canada should be aware of this, that the more wars they fight, the more bombs they drop, the more people they kill, the more refugees that will come their way. There is no stopping that. They are linked very strongly to each other.